Africa's debt crisis is not a new phenomenon. It is deeply rooted in history, entangled with the long shadow of colonialism. European powers, in their scramble for Africa's resources, imposed exploitative systems that crippled the continent's economic development. These colonial structures forced African nations into producing raw materials for European industries, stifling local manufacturing and innovation. The transition to independence did little to break these chains. Many African nations gained political independence, but remained economically tethered to their former colonizers. This dependence, coupled with weak governance structures and global economic shocks, created fertile ground for the seeds of debt to be sown. The Cold War further exacerbated the situation as both the West and the Soviet Union used aid and loans as political tools, often with little regard for long-term sustainability. This historical context is crucial to understanding the current debt crisis. It is not simply a case of poor financial management by African nations. It is a complex web of historical injustices, global power dynamics, and systemic inequalities that continue to shape the continent's economic landscape. Today, Africa faces a staggering debt burden. Total external debt for sub-Saharan Africa reached a record high, exceeding $750 billion. This figure represents a significant portion of the continent's combined GDP, highlighting the severity of the situation. Zambia, for example, became the first African nation to default on its debt during the COVID-19 pandemic. Its debt-to-GDP ratio soared above 100%, illustrating the precarious position of many African economies. This debt burden is not evenly distributed. Some countries, particularly those rich in natural resources like oil or minerals, have taken on massive loans for infrastructure projects. While these projects hold the promise of future growth, they also carry significant risks, especially if commodity prices fall or projects are mismanaged. Smaller, less resource-rich nations face their own set of challenges, often struggling to access affordable financing and grappling with limited capacity to manage debt effectively. The human cost of this debt crisis is immense. Every dollar spent servicing debt is a dollar that cannot be invested in education, healthcare, or critical infrastructure. This perpetuates a vicious cycle of poverty and underdevelopment, trapping millions in a system that seems designed to keep them down. It is a stark reminder that economic statistics tell only part of the story. Behind the numbers lie real lives and real struggles.
Several key factors have driven the surge in Africa's debt levels. One significant factor is the volatility of commodity prices. Many African economies are heavily reliant on exporting raw materials like oil, copper, and cocoa. When global prices for these commodities fall, as they did sharply in recent years, export revenues plummet, making it difficult for countries to service their debts. Another driver is the urgent need for infrastructure investment. Africa requires massive investments in roads, railways, energy, and digital infrastructure to unlock its economic potential. While some of this investment comes from domestic sources, a significant portion is financed through external loans. These loans, while essential for development, can quickly become unsustainable if projects experience delays, cost overruns, or fail to deliver the projected economic benefits. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated Africa's debt woes. The pandemic triggered a global recession, causing commodity prices to collapse and disrupting vital supply chains. Tourism, a crucial source of revenue for many African nations, ground to a halt. Governments were forced to increase spending on healthcare and social safety nets, even as their revenues dwindled. This perfect storm of crises pushed many African countries closer to the brink of debt distress.
Section 4. Lenders and Legacies, China, the West, and the Debt Dilemma. The landscape of Africa's creditors has shifted in recent decades. While traditional lenders like the Paris Club, a group of mostly Western creditor nations, still play a significant role, China has emerged as a major player in African lending. Chinese loans have financed a wide range of projects, from roads and railways to dams and telecommunications networks. This surge in Chinese lending has been met with both praise and criticism. Proponents argue that Chinese loans provide crucial financing for infrastructure development, which Western lenders have been hesitant to support. They point to the lack of political conditionalities attached to Chinese loans, contrasting it with the often stringent demands of Western institutions. Critics, however, raise concerns about debt sustainability, transparency, and the potential for these loans to create debt traps. They argue that some projects lack proper feasibility studies and environmental impact assessments, raising the risk of white elephant projects that fail to deliver promised benefits. The lack of transparency surrounding the terms of these loans also raises red flags, making it difficult to assess the true extent of Africa's indebtedness to China.
Section 5. A drop in the ocean. Debt relief and restructuring efforts. Recognizing the severity of Africa's debt crisis, the international community has undertaken various debt relief and restructuring initiatives. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries, or HIPC initiative, launched in the late 1990s, provided significant debt relief to eligible countries that met certain criteria. While HIPC provided some respite, it has been criticized for its limited scope and conditionalities that often led to cuts in social spending. The G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or DSSI, launched in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, offered temporary debt service suspension to eligible countries. While DSSI provided much-needed breathing room, it was a temporary measure that merely postponed debt payments rather than addressing the underlying debt burden. Moreover, private creditors, who hold a growing share of African debt, participated in DSSI on a voluntary basis, limiting its effectiveness. These initiatives, while well-intentioned, have often fallen short of addressing the root causes of Africa's debt crisis. They have been reactive rather than proactive, focusing on short-term relief rather than long-term solutions. A more comprehensive and sustainable approach is needed, one that addresses both the demand and supply sides of the debt equation.
Section 6. The crushing weight of debt. Consequences for Africa's future. The consequences of Africa's debt crisis are far-reaching and multifaceted. High debt levels divert scarce resources away from essential public services. Debt servicing consumes a significant portion of government revenues, leaving less money available for healthcare, education, infrastructure, and other critical investments. This underinvestment perpetuates a vicious cycle of poverty and underdevelopment, hindering Africa's ability to reach its full potential. Moreover, high debt levels can stifle economic growth. They create uncertainty and discourage private investment, as investors worry about the risk of debt default. This can lead to a downward spiral where low investment leads to low growth, further exacerbating the debt burden. The social and political consequences of the debt crisis are equally concerning. Austerity measures, often imposed as a condition for debt relief, can lead to social unrest and political instability. Governments struggling to service their debts may resort to repression to silence dissent, further eroding democratic institutions and undermining human rights. The debt crisis also threatens to derail Africa's progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs represent a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. However, the crushing weight of debt makes it increasingly difficult for African countries to make meaningful progress towards these goals.
Section 7. Breaking the Chains Towards a Sustainable Debt Future for Africa. Addressing Africa's debt crisis requires a multi-pronged approach that tackles both the symptoms and the underlying causes. It demands a concerted effort from both African governments and the international community based on shared responsibility and mutual accountability. Enhancing debt transparency is crucial. Greater disclosure of loan terms will allow for better risk assessment and prevent unsustainable lending practices. Improved transparency empowers citizens to hold their governments accountable. Economic diversification is another key pillar. Reducing reliance on commodity exports will make African countries less vulnerable to global price shocks. Investing in education, skills development, and technological innovation is essential. Strengthening domestic resource mobilization is also paramount. Broadening the tax base and combating illicit financial flows will increase domestic revenues. This reduces reliance on external borrowing and allows investment in critical sectors. The international community must play a more constructive role. Promoting responsible lending practices and providing debt relief are essential. Africa's debt crisis is a global challenge that requires a global response. The road ahead is challenging, but not insurmountable. By working together, we can break the chains of debt and create a brighter future for Africa and its people.